Also, and I think ongoing, the challenge of succession, of finding and bringing in new trustees. I mean,
Yeah.
Dan was, a mentee of Jake LeBeau.
Yeah.
I was a mentee of Dan. It's hard to find people that are willing to step up and serve in that
Well,
capacity.
let's be honest, most people, this is just a side gig, right? I mean, they're doing their lives, they got their jobs, they got all kinds of other stuff that's taking their attention. And you're gonna tell them you want them to step into this board, and by the way, we're gonna meet this many times a year, which was more than once a month, by the way. It was quite a few times, actually, between the special meetings and the rest of it.
Yeah.
And, that's a big ask, so. I mean, getting out of Mary's living room and having the office in Spring, which was still a long ways away, but it was an office, right, with actual staff that we could point people to. We could have a phone that was being answered on a regular hourly basis, We could actually produce some of our own publications up there, that sort of stuff. So that was one of the first ones. And it really wasn't that big of a step. It just meant convincing them they had the cash to do it, because you're tying into a long-term space contract. You're tying into salaries other than Mary's and others. But once you get, $1 million in the bank, which was probably happened in the first couple of years, because I think we grew from 300 to 500 plus, maybe 550 in about 3 years. And now you got the capital to actually run an organization that's meaningful. Not that it wasn't meaningful before, I don't want to get hammered on that point, because it was, but to really build it into something that had a little more pull in the state of Texas in terms of what it's about.
I would echo, on the milestones achieved, what Dan said about taking the association outside of the house, was significant and huge. I mean, it created, ADWBD as, a real entity.
Really real now.
Not that it was not doing great things before then, but it just kind of, cemented it as a standalone type entity. To Dan's point, I remember when I first started going to some of the trustee meetings, to see if that's where I needed to or wanted to step forward. Back in the day, probably 1997-ish or so, Jake LeBeau was the president.
Yeah.
There was this huge campaign about the 700 Club. There was like a church show about the 700 Club, right? And so the whole focus was we were trying to get our membership above 700. And we talked about, or the board talked about, I went on the board then, but how could you incentivize? How could you make that happen? How could you get above this threshold? And again, that was not only trying to get the Houston Galveston-centric people in, but the state into that program, right?
That's right.
And so we're well beyond that number now. But again, it's well above that. I mean, every conference that we had, in terms of the milestone achieved, I mean, to get to that point, every conference, I don't know that I've ever been to a conference that we didn't set a record for participant.
Mm-hmm.
Even when we went to New Orleans and we're afraid that people would not attend, we set a record. When we held the conference in Galveston and it froze,
I remember that one.
we still had record attendance.
Yeah.
And so from the lessons learned, it's like, number one, people wanted us to keep things in state. We did get a little bit of kickback from New Orleans. But at the same time, no matter what we did, record attendance every time. Again, getting a little bit probably more into the weeds than we need to, but we also, there were two things back in that time frame that we did that I think were pivotal. One of the things that we did, and Dan mentioned it, is Dan started the annual trustee planning retreat, and initially that was the trustees, maybe a few invited parties. And then when I became president, we opened that to all the to all the advisory committee members, because the thought was they are a full part of the team. And, the advisory council, they touch the membership every day. So much more than the trustees,
do, that's right.
that are directors and elected and all that stuff do. And so we opened, the planning sessions, created the planning sessions and then opened it up to that larger group of impactful people.
Goals of that planning session was not to just go through the SWOT analysis again, but also to really take a hard look at the vision and mission statements and make sure that they still met what we wanted them to do, right? And so we would tweak them a lot. Sometimes we didn't, but we would really take a look at every word, and we would do it in separate groups and make everybody come back together and compare and state what they discussed. Because if you're in one group, you always have folks like myself who tends to take over the conversation, and so you really want people that are quieter to actually participate because they've got some good ideas, right? There was a lot of tricks that I used back in those days, and I was pretty good at it because I was doing it.
He kind of rolled that out the first year I was a trustee, and as a new trustee, anxious to be on board, and participate and stuff. I got thrown into this meeting with advisory council people that it's their career and they've been doing this stuff for years, and the questions that Dan was asking, I was like, I mean, really, it made me think, made me plan for the future and stuff like that, and want to be involved, but as a trustee, it was kind of overwhelming. It cemented the relationships, and one of the lessons learned is AWBD is a family,
Yeah.